This is the Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs, featuring Nicholas Gvosdev, Tatiana Serafin, and Rachel Ziemba. This episode was recorded on May 20th, 2021.
Welcome, everyone, to this latest issue of the Doorstep podcast. I'm your co-host, senior fellow here at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also senior fellow at Carnegie Council. And we are so excited to welcome today Rachel Ziemba, adjunct senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security. Her research focuses on interlinkages between economics, finance, and security issues, but she's here today with us to speak about sanctions. Sanctions. We have big news we'll get to, but our latest doorsteps have focused so much on foreign policy, omni policy, what is Biden doing in principle and in engagement, but we really wanted to get into the nitty gritty of how do you do foreign policy? And certainly sanctions is one tool of maybe getting things done. I don't know. Let's talk sanctions. Are they effective? What is Biden's policy? And then we can get into some news on Nord Stream 2. Rachel, take it away.
Sure, great. I think it's great to start, especially on the effectiveness issue, because I think one of the things that Biden and his team have come in with, or the people that, I should even say Secretary Yellen and Blinken and their teams have come in, is with a focus on trying to make things more effective. And the first thing I often end up thinking about when I think about effectiveness is effectiveness of what? At the end of the day, these are foreign policy tools. And so effectiveness should be around policy change. It shouldn't just be around, can you inflict economic pain, right? We can be very good at constructing things that cause economic pain, but those sometimes can actually undermine that sort of policy change that one might be looking for. A lot of research, academic and policy oriented, suggests, for example, that central government actors or dominant players in an economy, say linked to a military, can actually end up stronger even if they're the ones sanctioned. So we can look at examples like the IRGC in Iran, for example, which has had, if anything, has consolidated power. We can also look at large state or state-linked entities in Russia, who were some of the only ones who could gather together the foreign exchange. So in one way of looking at it, you might say, that was an unintended consequence. And so one of the things Biden and his team, who include a number of my former colleagues at CNAS, are really trying to think about, how do you target this better? But yeah, I guess back to your question of, do we have cases where sanctions have been effective in prompting policy change? And the list is not long. Right, Iran in and around 2012 to 15, the JCPOA is often an example cited. South Africa, towards the end of apartheid, is often cited. There are other partial examples where the best we can say is maybe they stopped the entity from doing more of the behavior. So, for example, how do we exactly interpret Russia in 2014, 2015? Would they have gone on to Kiev if the sanctions hadn't been imposed? There's other questions there. But I think in all the cases that worked or sort of worked, we see a dynamic not only where there's a desire to avoid and alleviate economic pain, but maybe there's some upside towards compliance or shift. So, for example, the Iranians thought, well, not only will we avoid this damaging search situation, but maybe we can actually get access to US products or European products. So I think you need both that removal of the negative and the positive.
But even so we're talking, you mentioned some examples. It's 2021. Should we be thinking of new tools? Is this kind of a relic? We talk here a lot at the Doorstep about some relics of the Cold War, and this is a new generation. And our audience, our Doorstep audience, do they care? Should.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's most, interesting about the way the Biden team came in is there's and a lot of the Biden team are folks that had been in the Obama administration and then spent time out of government, either in think tank land or in the private sector, or maybe more in think tank land. And a lot of them, people like my former colleagues, Liz Rosenberg and Peter Harrell, Neil Bhatia, a whole variety of people spent a lot of time and efforts that I was privileged to be involved in, of trying to think about how do we use these tools more effectively. And so one of the most important things is to say that we have, I think there is an understanding of saying, well, we have all these restrictive tools, or I would think of them as restrictive tools. So we're cutting off access to US financial banking system. We're cutting off access, or encouraging our allies to cut off access to certain companies doing foreign investment. We're cutting off access to goods, export controls. So you have all these restrictive elements. And so we're only just starting to think about the positive side of economic statecraft. The problem is that often the positive side involves spending money, whereas the restrictive side involves cutting off access to money or resources in some way. And spending money both means it tends to have to go through Congress or whatever legislative body. And sometimes it involves spending money internationally, which causes all sorts of domestic politics issues. So, but if we look, for example, at some of the pieces of legislation that are wending their way through Congress, and we can a number of them are saying, well, you know what, let's spend money to work with allied militaries in ASEAN, for example, or let's spend money, some of the spending more money or building up resilience is sort of providing alternatives, because as I'm sure you folks at the Doorstep have been sort of talking about, one of the big challenges when the US goes and says, well, work with us allies and don't use Chinese products or don't interact with these entities. And maybe the argument's a little stronger with China than with entities like Iran and Venezuela. But if you go around and say, well, don't use 5G, or don't use Huawei 5G, well, what's your alternative? And is it worth it if it's that much more costly? So I'm not saying that the US and allies are going to create an alternative to Huawei overnight. But I think thinking around what's the positive alternative, rather than just sort of, well, if you do this, it's dangerous for you. And oh, by the way, you might face secondary sanctions. And that's where I think you see some of this balancing, this balancing act. Also, a little more strategy of trying to think about, well, what are the core interests that the US faces? And so I think, I'm sure we'll get into the Nord Stream 2 sanctions, but one of the considerations is, what's the broader bilateral relationship with Europe and with Germany? What does it mean? If you avoid sanctions on something, can you get interests more aligned on China policy? And that's still an open question. But the positive thing, I think, is also that there's a little more attempt to align with strategy. Problem is that some elements of foreign policy end up having to be reactive. So, for example, we've seen early in the administration, one of the most active sanctions programs has actually been Myanmar, or Burma, as it's called in the US. And that was really a reaction to a coup in Myanmar. We've also seen, of course, reaction to Russian actions. So it's not easy to sort of have that time to create the new strategies.
Can I just jump in? As I'm listening to you discuss sanctions, and particularly the idea that it's easier to cut off, to restrict, than it is to encourage people to spend more money. But one of the things with the cutting off aspect, it does seem that sanctions are most effective when you're cutting off goods and services to a country that wants those goods and services from us, but where the US or US firms or US financial institutions aren't particularly that well invested. So Myanmar, Iran, Venezuela, it's not as if there's going to be widespread layoffs in Wall Street if you impose financial sanctions on Myanmar. There may be other places where that has more of an impact. And you've talked about the people that are on the teams. What's the sense that you have that the calibration of kind of the punitive aspect of sanctions on other countries to try to compel or deter them from doing things, but also then trying to assess, is there a process where someone in government says, what's the impact on on Americans, right? If we sanction, so, again, with Iran, maybe we can't get carpets, we can't get pistachios, we have to get caviar. Maybe we're not going to get it from Russia either, so we're going to get it. But I mean, there's a sense that when we impose sanctions on Iran, that there wasn't a real cost for Americans, so that Americans weren't going to wake up and say, why can't I get, Persian pistachios for my cooking today? But is there a sense that you have that they do try to calibrate that, where someone comes in and says, look, that you impose a sanction on this entity, this American company won't sell Caterpillar tractors or Ford motor vehicles, and then they're going to buy from Europeans or Japanese or Chinese, and that's a bad thing? I mean, what's your sense of how that dynamic plays out?
Yeah. One of the challenges, and I know we jumped into it without kind of defining financial sanctions, and what's of course interesting, so it's a whole bucket, but a lot of things we talk about are these financial sanctions, which is this sort of arguably asymmetric use of power. You have sort of the US-based financial system, US dollar-based financial system, which of course incorporates much of Europe, or incorporates Europe and incorporates much of the sort of Asian, allies. And so in a sense, some of the financial sanctions are response to sort of two problems, right? One is that for some of these countries like Iran, I mean, the US has had some form of sanctions on Iran for my whole lifetime. I mean, so there wasn't a lot of trade to stop directly from the US. So this use of financial power was a way to impose a cost, which the US couldn't do via just sort of cutting off trade, because it had already done that. And so the sanctions programs, and it was really with Iraq in the early 90s that some of this sort of asymmetry, this use of financial power was sort of first used. And it's often in the use of the financial transactions, which restrict the exports and flow of goods and access to finances from third countries. So, and that in and of itself creates a whole set of problems. Now, in the 2010s, when there was more of a global consensus, for example, vis-a-vis Iran, the European companies that were doing business with Iran, they might not have liked having to pull out, but there was a political will and consensus. And what I think was so controversial about the Trump administration withdrawal from the JCPOA and reimposition and even greater imposition of sanctions was this political disconnect between the US and its allies, and even its adversaries like China and Russia, which weren't opposing sanctions to the same extent some years earlier. So in any case, this asymmetry sort of comes to play in a few different ways. And I think what's challenging is the bigger a country you're targeting. So I think there, for example, a different set of issues when you talk about Russia. There's an even bigger set of issues when you talk about China, right? Second largest global economy by purchasing power parity, even sort of bigger than that. You're looking at large domestic financial markets, and you're looking at a country that the US does do a lot of trade with. And so that's where I think you've seen, and US allies, the entities that would also need to be sort of on board, also involved. Plus, at the end of the day, the last thing you want is to get some sort of policy change and end up with a global recession. Right? And so I think that calibration is something that's considered in most of sort of sanctions legislation. And I should note that often sanctions have ended up as a shared responsibility, often, like there might be a broad authorization that might be granted by Congress, and then the administration does some of the details. And right now, and we see it with two key sanctions programs, Iran and Russia, there is a real tug of war between Congress and the administration on who gets to decide. And some of that I would look at as, with my sort of IPE IR hat on and say, well, this is institutional politics at work. any legislature is always going to want to have more say, and any administration is always going to want to have more freedom, unless it helps them internationally to say, oh, my domestic constituencies are constraining us in this way. So we can get into more of the details of that, but I do think this this sort of issue here around allies, because all of the research would say that those cases I mentioned earlier about effective cases tended to be multilateral. Not always UN, sort of seal of approval, but broad. And some of the challenge, like with a country like Myanmar, it might not hurt the US and US consumers, but the US doesn't trade much with Myanmar, so it doesn't actually hurt very much. And so one of the debates about the Myanmar program right now is that allies that do have more trade and financial flows, like Japan, like Australia, have not been willing to sort of join these. But no, they're worried about, well, will the US step up and do secondary sanctions that might impound Myanmar, sort of Myanmar's finances in their countries. Other countries that are, that maybe would be in a different category, like Thailand, also potentially exposed. But I think this question of multilateral issues. One more point on multilateral that I think might be useful to kind of put on the table is that as the US has encouraged more allies to join them on sanctions, to beef up, and it's not just sanctions, to beef up export controls, to beef up investment review processes, it means many more countries have some sort of process. And for companies who already do a lot of due diligence, because the last thing you want as a major company is to have a big fine. Now, maybe if your business opportunity is this big and the fine is like this big, maybe it's kind of like doing a ransom, sort of paying a ransom. But that's another topic that I'm sure you guys will be getting into with other people who are more expert on it than I. But so the due diligence, the compliance process for, which entities are on the SDN list, which are on the comparable list for Canada, for Australia, for the United Kingdom, and the list just goes on. And so there are some smaller countries that just get really stuck with what we'd call derisking. So companies that just decide, banks that just decide, it's just not worth doing business with anyone in this jurisdiction because the costs of compliance, the risks are just too high, and the reward just isn't there.
It's so interesting what you say on multilateralism, and I want to go to the topic of, so it works better if there's more of us agreeing on it, but it also has to work in terms of enforcement. So there's the company saying, I'm going to comply, but who's enforcing it? If you look at, nobody's really enforcing UN sanctions, really. Like, it all falls to states or, non-state actors. And I go to a tweet of yours from today. About, is Iranian crude coming to Canada indirectly through relabeled third countries to skirt sanctions? Who's enforcing this?
Yeah.
I think, is that a bigger problem? So that then sanctions just become rhetoric. And that's why maybe, the average consumer doesn't pay attention to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess one of the things, and that was an interesting one, somebody had highlighted that the official Chinese data said that they had imported 0 barrels of oil from Iran for the last 4 months. And, if Iran's, we know from good reporting and, great entities like tanker trackers and things like that, we're talking about our tools need to be reinvented. One of the great things for those of us tracking these issues is some of the data sources have been really reinvented and reinvigorated, and that helps policymakers. It also helps, people like us. But is this sort of element of, we know that China is buying Iranian crude, we know they're buying Venezuelan crude, sometimes with countries like Iran or Venezuela that may not have great economic data or maybe intermittent. People like me will look and say, well, what are the Chinese reporting about their bilateral trade? What are the Koreans or Turks or others reporting? So in this case, and one of my friends, and really sort of a go-to analyst on all things Iranian economy, but also more generally sort of in West Asia, your Batman, came very quickly with a nice chart showing that, well, you know what, in the same time period, Chinese imports from Malaysia increased by a lot. And we know, for example, Malaysia is one of the places not only where Iranian crude is transiting, but probably Venezuelan crude is transiting and being diluted with other things. So I think you're highlighting a point, which is, as you have stricter and stricter sanctions, and I'll get back to who enforces in a moment, but as you have stricter and stricter sanctions, you can end up with either sort of shell companies. It's a little bit of a game of whack-a-mole from an enforcement perspective. And that's why you sometimes see, because it pops up somewhere else. But that's why you sometimes see entities on the OFAC designation list, and I'll come back to who OFAC is in a moment, but on with many names, or sometimes an entity, sort of a special designated, sort of national entity name will just be the name is updated. And there can be cases of people who get sort of misadded to the list. There was a case earlier this year of an Italian businessman who got, I think he owns a pizza place somewhere in Italy. I don't remember the story, but he got added by mistake. And he had this whole legal battle to prove that he wasn't really the person with the similar name who was doing trading in Venezuela. But back to enforcement and who's doing the enforcement. At this point, at a global level, the biggest enforcement tool really is the U.S. Office of Foreign Assets Control, which sits within the U.S. Treasury. And one of the dynamics, it is, as I say, really the enforcement arm. It imposes, sort of manages the sanctions. If someone is in violation, they impose fines. There can be other things that we work with economic sanctions, export control measures. Those are done in the US, or done by the Department of Commerce, BIS division. So like, for example, in the last week or so, there was a settlement from goods that went to Iran some years ago, sort of cloud computing software from a German, entity that was sold to a third party in the UAE or elsewhere. And so they're now facing fines for transactions from, several years ago. But that's an interesting question on a multilateral level, because few other countries have the number of people working for entities to just even track and enforce these things. Often in sanctions entities in other countries, they spend some of their time thinking about, entities to sanction, but they spend a lot of time just keeping tabs on what the US is doing. Right? Both because they might want to align, but also because they want to be able to provide sort of advice to their ministries. But in general, and we can look at the examples of countries like Australia, Canada, and the UK that for different reasons have either expanded or started up sort of sanctions programs the last few years. I mean, the UK's case, because they exited the European Union and therefore were no longer part of that overarching structure. Though they did basically grandfather in all of the currently active European sanctions. But across the board, even scaled per capita, there tend to be a lot fewer bureaucrats involved and the like. I think on the UN side, you raise an important point, and that I think is not just a sanctions issue, that's a broader UN issue. At the end of the day, there's this tension that I know you've talked about of how strong member states want the UN to be, and legacy issues of who's in the Security Council. And so that issue is the case. I do think when there are UN sanctions, that can sometimes give a seal of approval to countries that are not permanent members to enforce or sort of comply. And so I think you had a particular circumstance, especially with Iran and North Korea sanctions, that because there had been certain UN things that they could force compliance, or they could encourage compliance, but that really came from a bilateral basis rather than for some sort of strength, rather than some sort of other point.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. We keep mentioning the same countries, Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, Myanmar, these tend to be the countries that we talk about. And there's also issues like, narcotics trafficking and certainly the cyber warfare. We've seen a lot of activity coming from the administration. And I was reading something that the US actually uses sanctions more than any other country as a tool, which I thought was interesting if we look at, is the US still a dominant player in the world? So in your view, do you think that we still have this authority to an influence with sanctions, in a world that's becoming more maybe China versus US?
Mhm. As with so many important questions, I would say yes and no, right? Yes, because I think, in a sense, both there's this sort of fear factor, right? I think there's some interesting sort of test cases of and Nord Stream 2 in Germany is, I think, sort of case in point. The U.S. has opted to waive sanctions implementation on the German entities, but not on the involved Russian entities. That's part of a broader diplomatic process. It's also part of a broader democratic political process, perhaps in Germany, right? We know that the Greens, who I'm not as versed in the exact, sort of electoral math in Germany, which is very complicated, but the Greens have a chance of providing the next chancellor. And they're on the record as saying that they don't think it meets geostrategic interests of Germany or environmental issues. So they have stated, no, it's easier on the campaign trail to say you'd stop something as opposed to what do you do when you're in office, and especially what do you do when you're in office if something's already built, rather than you have to sort of spend money or continue to build it. Like legacy infrastructure can drive a lot of path dependence. So I think that's an open question. It doesn't, I'm not, you can tell from the way I'm talking about that I'm not super optimistic that it will go in the way that the US is hoping. I think the other issue is, it goes back to this issue of restrictions versus, sort of positive kind of almost, what are you creating? And I do think that you have had a number of allies sort of coming around and finding, if it doesn't cost too much to comply, people tend to comply. And we see that with sort of even things like in trade policy, right? That people will pay the countries and companies will pay the fines if it's not that great. They'll fight it if it's, if it's a bigger issue. I think it's interesting to look at what are the subject areas or the thematic areas, that where there has been more coordination since, in the last couple of months of the Biden administration around human rights and anti-corruption issues, individual sanctions. Those tend to be things where there have been a number of cases where the US has often announced sanctions that either at the same time as allies, like the new measures against Myanmar earlier this week. I think it was this week, not last week. But in any event, in mid-May. You've also seen, for example, some coordination, not exactly at the same time, but on entities involved in the poisoning and detention of Alexei Navalny. And we've seen, for example, over the last several years, a number of countries introduce the programs that are aligned with what in the US we call global Magnitsky sanctions, which they vary a little bit country by country, but they often involve sort of human rights restrictions, corruption, other things, and they could actually have quite a wide scope. So the European Union, for example, introduced those measures first, or that authority first, sort of towards the end of last year. So I think on these human rights issues, there maybe is a little more alignment. But that brings up another important, challenging point that is, I think, something different the Biden administration is trying to put on the table compared to the Trump administration. And that's that they're trying to recalibrate sanctions to avoid exacerbating humanitarian crises. Now, I think if you look at a country like Iran or Venezuela or North Korea that still have what I'd call maximum pressure sanctions, it's very difficult to have humanitarian carve-outs that work. I also think that the Trump administration didn't try to have humanitarian carve-outs that worked, and they blocked efforts from European entities to do that, for example, on Iran. And, you know, because despite all these sanctions, they are supposed to allow access to finance for needed, you know, health goods, basic supplies. And I think that that's sort of the de-risking point that we were talking about earlier. A lot of entities, if every bank in a country is sanctioned as it is in Iran, a lot of entities that don't want to take that, you know, take that risk, take the sanctions risk. So we have seen a few moves here and there to kind of put in general licenses or sort of sanctions waivers or exemptions for a particular type of trade, say the involvement in international humanitarian issues, say for essential things like search and rescue activities that might be necessary that an entity was involved in. But I think there's probably been more talk about recalibration than has actually occurred so far. And where I'd really be watching for that is in places like Venezuela. With Iran, of course, as the negotiations go on, there's a meaningful potential for a much greater lifting of sanctions. And then I think we see the types of entities that have been sanctioned in Myanmar reflect this. There has been a reluctance to sanction, for example, companies involved in the natural gas trade directly, or to encourage third country banks to seize those assets or make it only available for, or freeze those assets. Apologies. Well, I guess depending on your perspective, freeze and seize might be quite similar. But this is an area where I think even though, and Myanmar is an interesting case that I've recently been working on, where even though a number of the activists have been out in public asking for tougher secondary sectoral sanctions, I think the US has been trying to calibrate it, partly because they want allies on board, but they also want to be proportional.
I'd like to, some points that you were in your last answer and in the discussion that I kind of would like to tease out a bit more and connect. You were talking a bit about, you know, the United States and European countries increasingly applying these personalized sanctions based upon global Magnitsky. But then we've also seen a reluctance, particularly in constituencies in London, New York, Miami, Los Angeles, about sort of blanket sanctions if it may affect the property market, right? We have a whole list of bad actors we want to sanction, but at the same time, we don't want to prevent wealthy oligarch, semi-oligarch types from a number of countries from buying condos that they may or may not live in, you know, as a separate question. With the Nord Stream sanctions, what I always thought was fascinating was the Trump administration attempted, probably very crudely, but attempted to try to do a doorstep link, which is to say, well, we want to sanction this pipeline so that Germany is going to buy more from American sources of energy. And then the Biden administration seems to have kind of downplayed that. But with the Nord Stream sanctions, I mean, is there a sense that, you know, right as Anthony Blinken and Sergei Lavrov are meeting in Iceland, we announced the sanctions, we immediately wave on the Germans. Is there also a sense, though, that there's a sense that we're vulnerable to German actions, that the Germans might get mad and say, all right, we're going to impose some counter sanctions, and then, you know, that becomes an issue for, as you said, in the transatlantic relationship. So this is less about Russia and more about that question there. So again, this sense of the limits of how far we're willing to sanction if we think that there's a domestic cost, or that there's a domestic, whether it's, you know, real estate developers in New York or, oil and gas field workers in Montana or even in Pennsylvania, for that matter.
Exactly. Or even the operations of US or European company, abroad, abroad. So you think about what are the interests, of Total or Exxon or different sort of things in these different jurisdictions. The lobbying effort, those sort of entities can often have quite powerful lobbying efforts, particularly if it's a jurisdiction that generally has been good for them to work in, right? I think you could argue under different periods of time where there were oil companies, for example, that had not been happy with their Iranian counterparts, irrespective of sanctions. And so there might have been more willingness to sort of exit. But, I digress. So I think this sort of point about counter sanctions and efforts to build resilience against US and other sanctions, which is something that I've neglected to talk about, not because it's unimportant, but I think it's an important one because just as many countries have built up sanctions capacity, there's been a lot more talk about, in Europe, they call it strategic autonomy, and it goes in, sort of in waves, but this effort, and that's very much triggered by concerns about US unilateral extraterritorial sanctions that restrict, that constrict European foreign policy. Not only this issue of providing humanitarian goods to Iran or other trade that they think is legitimate to Iran, but then also Russia, which is an even bigger economic player, especially vis-a-vis Germany, and there are divergent views in the European Union about all of these issues. And one thing we haven't mentioned, but where the EU is concerned, for the EU to impose sanctions, all the countries have to agree to lift or to put them on. And so, for example, that has, I would say, it's had implications, of course, the Russia sanctions. Paradoxically, it's made it easier to keep the existing ones from 2014 and 15 in place because because keeping that consensus is easier, but it's much harder to get new ones. And getting any measures that address China beyond very targeted ones has been very difficult. And so there's another sort of whole set of discussions about EU policy making and what's done at a nation state level versus the other, which I'm sure will come up at different points. But so far, one of the challenges from the European side is having to weigh, well, is it worth whatever country they're involved in versus access sort of to US markets and the like. Now, during the Trump administration, not only did you have these elements where European foreign policy was being sort of encroached because of sanctions, but you also had the Trump administration having a very different view than past administrations about ally trade policy. So, for example, we had quite substantial tariffs on key goods between the US and Europe, between the US and Canada, for that matter, the US and its Asian allies as well. So I think you had a dynamic where both things, the direct interests at home in some of these allies and the foreign policy, the power projection and influence projection that countries were trying to do were both being impeded. And now the Biden administration does want to work with allies, but they want to work with allies to serve what the US interests are, what the US determines the global interests are. So I think regardless, we have a dynamic where global rules are being rewritten and the like. Now, one country that we haven't talked much about from a counter sanctions measure, but I think it's important, is China. China, of course, there's a whole literature, including some written by myself and colleagues on Chinese coercive policies initiated by China, but also in response to US measures. Over the last year or two, China put in place what's called a blocking mechanism and other efforts that would at least theoretically make it more difficult, would say it's illegal for Chinese businesses to comply with US sanctions. Now, in practice, that's hard to, I mean, the European Union has legislation like that. It was first brought in to address the US extraterritorial sanctions on Cuba, and then it was updated some years ago vis-a-vis Iran. And that blocking legislation basically says that European companies that lose operations solely because of US sanctions are liable to some sort of compensation. It's a little vague from whom, but also, as it always is, but also that theoretically it's illegal for them to comply. Now, there have not been a lot of test cases, partly because contracts were written very carefully, and a lot of European countries' withdrawal from countries like Iran, they went out of their way to say it wasn't just about sanctions. It was about operating environment. It was about this, it was that. And some of these things, of course, sanctions lawyers and other lawyers are, sort of kept very busy by this. So I do think net, and this probably ties to some of the doorstep issues, net, this whole web has a result of thickening borders, of encourage, if we see it at the same time as sort of other trends to sort of deepen supply chains in major economies and continental economies. And I think it just adds, as I say, compliance and due diligence costs. And I'm not, spouting here, sort of corporate ideas to say, well, there shouldn't be regulation. I'm a big believer in the right regulation. I just am aware that sometimes these sort of due diligence elements and the expectations, especially in this context, we have all these shell companies and barter trade, it becomes very difficult to operate. And US policymakers know very well, because some of this web made it very difficult, even after the JCPOA, to convince companies that it was safe to go back into Iran. Now, that was justified. I mean, the company's fears were clearly justified, right? Because only a few years later, the US, but this sort of whole question mark of, well, you've suspended the sanctions, but you haven't removed them. And what's the kind of, what's the risk profile there? Again, it comes back to what's your upside and what's your potential downside.
Thank you so much for joining us, Rachel. We're going to leave it on what is the upside, what is the downside in terms of the doorstep. And we hope to have you back as we look at the effect of Biden's sanctions policies over the next couple of months.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. For more, go to carnegiecouncil.org. Stay healthy and safe.